In this lesson, we're going to go through some different places that information may be stored that you may not otherwise notice. Now, the first thing I want to talk about here is something called slack space. So you can see, if you look down at the bottom here, the size of these different files. So in this case, we've got a file of 1.57 kilobytes. Now, the way that this file is stored in the file system, it takes up that 1.57 kilobytes, but additional space has been allocated, and that's because we don't allocate space on a file system on a byte-by-byte basis. We allocate it based in a cluster or a block. So in some file systems, Windows, for example, you would have a 4K file block or cluster. So there would be 4 kilobytes of space on that file system where this particular file here would be stored. Even though it's only 1.5K, it's still got that 4K of space allocated to it because it's been allocated one block or one cluster. Now that gives us almost 2.5K worth of what we call slack space. And the slack space is the space that has been allocated to a file that is not actually being used. So again, we've got about 2.5K here out of this particular file where we're not actually using that space on the hard drive because it's been allocated to that file. Nobody else other than that file can use it, but it's still empty data. So that slack space can actually be made use of. Let me just bring up this program here called WinHex, and WinHex is a hexadecimal editor. It's going to show us the hexadecimal of different files, and we can actually open up the hard drive itself and take a look. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to open the disk, and I'm going to open the C drive, and it's going to go scanning through and traversing the drive, and eventually it will pull up the directory list for this particular drive. And you can see it's already started to show some data here. And this is actually the very beginning of the hard drive. You can see there's the 0 offset, and on the right-hand side here, there's the sort of human-readable version of what's on that drive. And on the very far right, you can see some information about the drive itself. So you can see it's 61% free. It's an NTFS file system. And we are at cluster number 0. And then it's got information about snapshot and some other things. Now I could actually go in here and let's see if we can find where I just was. So I was in the users directory in administrator, and you can see it's replacing down here. It's showing us the spot on the drive where it actually is located. And where I was in, not actually in that one. I was in another drive that I can't actually look at because it's not really connected. But let's just take a look here. So sample.txt is a file that was used in another lesson when we were talking about alternate data streams. And so let's take a look here at sample.txt. There's some information. You can see the file name here, sample.txt, and then some text. And then you can also see the alternate data stream, which is hidden.txt. Now, after some text, you can see there's a number of bytes there that are not actually being used. And that would be slack space. And similarly, you can also see some slack space here where there's just no data in between the files on the file system. And that's because that's space that's not being used by the file, but has actually been allocated to the file by the file system. So slack space is a place to store useful information. You can see that I've scrolled up to actually the top of the hard drive now. Now what I can do here is if I go to the specialist directory, I could actually gather the slack space. So I could pull all of the slack space on this hard drive together. And if I do that, it's actually going to ask me, so where would I like to store it? And I wouldn't store it on the file system where I was. I would actually store it somewhere else. Like, for example, this temp store is a USB stick that's attached to my system at the moment. That may not be enough storage. You may actually need a very large storage device to gather all of the slack space together. But I could pull the slack space together, and then I would have one file with all of the data that was in all of the slack space, and I may be able to do some digging around through that file to see what may be stored there in the case of somebody storing information in that slack space. Now, similarly, I could gather free space together, and I would want to store that on a different hard drive as well. And free space, there may be data like, for example, files that have previously been deleted and are now marked free, but the data is still there. And so we may want to be able to gather the free space together so we can try to reconstruct some deleted files or previously deleted files. So I could do this gather free space here. So another place where you may want to take a look at some information or a particular file is, let's just jump up here. So there are some files that are stored in the root of your hard drive, and what I'm looking for here is, the first one is the Hyber file. It's hyberfill.sys, and that's the file that is allocated for a hibernation. So when a system goes into hibernation, what happens is all of the memory, all of the physical memory that's in the system would be written out to this hibernation file. So when it booted back up, the physical memory would just get repopulated by what's in this hibernation file. And because of that, everything would just go back to exactly the way it was when you hibernated it. Now there's another file over here called pagefile.sys, and the page file is where we store virtual memory. So if there are programs running and we need to swap pieces of those programs out of physical memory, we would store them on the hard drive in this file that's called pagefile.sys. And you can see there's a little bit of data here, although it looks not particularly readable. But if you go digging through this page file, you may actually find some interesting information based on what programs have stored in this page file, or what's actually being used in programs that are running in memory. So there's a lot of information that's stored on the file system that you may not normally see, or you wouldn't normally see. For example, the slack space, and the hibernation file and the page file also would probably typically get overlooked, and you wouldn't normally see what's in those files or go looking at what's in those files. And the thing about the page file is, in the page file, you may actually be able to look at artifacts from programs that were running when the system was shut down. So you could take a hard drive out of a system that had been shut down, open up this page file, and you may be able to find artifacts from programs that were running when the system was shut down, depending on what the settings for the particular system were and whether they were set to clear the page file or not. So here, for example, we can see there's some strings that we may recognize, and we've got VBS, VBE, JS, JSE, processor architecture AMD 64, processor ident 6. So there is some information that's stored in this page file that you can actually read and be able to get access to. So some of the different places on the hard drive where you may find information that a user wouldn't typically think to look for it, and somebody who's engaged in malicious activity may actually be storing it in one of these places.